This is the KNBC News Service with Tom Brokaw.
For in-studio use only. The entire film production I've embarked upon here at Cannon Air Force Base near Clovis, New Mexico is the sole responsibility of I, Tom Brokaw. Jack Wolf has nothing to do with it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ross Porter. We've got a guest today who needs no introduction, but I will list his accomplishments with you in just a few seconds. He was regarded as the top American network television newscaster for a number of years. He was one of the best. A friend of mine because he and I worked together at KNBC in Los Angeles for about 5 years. And it's wonderful to have him aboard today. The pride of Yankton, South Dakota, Tom Brokaw. Tom, how are you?
I'm very well, Ross. I'm glad you worked that in. We did have a great time together there at KNBC in Los Angeles. And later I'll talk about the most memorable night, and you'll remember it involved Woody Hayes, as you may recall.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember that. Well, you retired in January this year after 55 years at NBC News. Didn't that make you the longest standing anchor in America at the same network?
Yeah, it is. And when I look back on it, I'm just astonished. I was so lucky in many ways. As you said, I grew up in a small town in South Dakota. And then I caught the wave at the right time. I started in Sioux City, and then I went quickly to Atlanta, and then they picked me up and brought me to Los Angeles. And that's when you and I began to work together, and I was 26 at the time. Yeah. And after that, I went on to Washington to become the White House correspondent, and from there to the Today Show, and then to Nightly News. And it all seems now kind of like a fantasy because I was so lucky, and it was what I had dreamed of, never thinking it could come true when I was spending time out there in South Dakota, marrying Meredith, who you know.
Yes.
My high school classmate and Miss South Dakota. And
Miss South Dakota, yes, she was.
We've had a wonderful life. We're here in Montana now, where we spend a lot of time.
You will be married 60 years next year. Lynn and I reached 60 in June. So that is kind of comparable, isn't it?
Well, I just think it was a representative of our generation. We married the first girl that we fell in love with, and we kept the marriage going. And we were always thought the most of the two of you, especially when you started turning out all those twins.
Well, for those who don't know, Lynn and I had two sets of twins, boy, girl each time. They're in their 50s now and doing very well. Tom, when you left Los Angeles, as you say, you became the White House correspondent for NBC, then co-anchor of the Today Show for 5 years, anchor and managing editor of NBC's Nightly News for 22 years. And before that, 4 years as the program's weekend anchor. Folks, Tom Brokaw is the only person to have hosted all three major NBC News programs.
I remember when you and I were standing there together when Woody Hayes got in big trouble, because he slugged a photographer. Then it turns out he hit the wrong guy.
Yeah, he tackled a player, didn't he?
Well, and all the Ohio State monkey marks said to Hayes, "You've got to go on Tom Brokaw and Ross because they're the most popular guys in town." So he came on and he had a chip on his shoulder. You remember that? He was not happy about it.
I don't. You must have interviewed him.
And then he was waiting for us, and it turns out he hit the guy that he didn't mean to hit. He meant to hit another guy. So those were the days.
Yeah. Your TV career began in Sioux City, Iowa. Not only as a newsman, Brokaw, but I just read the other day that you also did the weather at some times. Is that correct?
I've often wanted to go back and apologize to all those people who listened to my weather forecast because I didn't know what the hell I was talking about.
Well, you continued, well, in Omaha and Atlanta. You came to KNBC in Los Angeles in 1966. You got there, I think, about 6 months before I did. You said that you were 26. I was 27. And remember, we lived about 4 blocks apart, and Meredith and Lynn used the same cleaning crew.
Right, they did. I remember that.
Tom announced the 11 o'clock news every weeknight for 6 years. And I sat next to him, giving the sports report. And those last 4 years before he went east, the first person to give the sports report on the 11 o'clock newscast was our mutual friend, Rafer Johnson. Now, if you don't know, friends, Rafer won the Olympic gold medal in the decathlon at the games in Rome in 1960. If you don't know what the decathlon is, made up of 10 track and field events, 4 running, 3 jumping, 3 throwing. And the winner of the decathlon is usually considered the best athlete in the world. I have a trivia question for you. Who was Rafer Johnson's roommate at the Rome games?
Boy, that's one of the few things I don't know about it.
Cassius
I remember
Clay.
who? Oh,
Cassius Clay.
Cassius
Who later
Clay.
became
I'm not surprised.
Muhammad Ali. Yeah. In 1989, you were the first English language broadcast journalist to report the fall of the Berlin Wall. You stood on the west side of the Brandenburg Gate. How were you able to do that? Did you get a tip?
Well, it's a great story, and it's a great story in part because I can share it with some of my colleagues. We had a very good foreign editor at NBC in those days, and he came to me on Monday and said, you know, not much going on here. Well, why don't you go to Germany? This seems to be kind of boiling. And I said, that's a great idea. So I went over. I flew all night. We didn't tell anybody. And the next day when I was there, it was very quiet in Berlin on both sides. And then on the second day, we were all in the kind of worn out. It was a huge press corps. And a East German, only describe him as a flack. He got this piece of paper and he said, oh, we can now allow East Germans to go through the gate. And if they come back, he read it all wrong. They didn't want him to go out. They wanted him to stay where they were. So everybody looked at each other and said, are we hearing things? What's going on here? I had the only interview with him. I went upstairs. Gunter Schabowski was his name. And I said, Mr. Schabowski, read that again. And he read it and said, it means that you can go out through the gate and then return through the same gate. Well, he was misinterpreting everything. I called New York and I said, kill everything. The Berlin Wall is coming down. It's a huge, huge story.
Earlier this evening, the Communist Central Committee in East Berlin proposed an action program, including free elections and a democratic coalition government. Tonight, citizens from both Germanys are singing and dancing on the wall itself, reunited right on top of that harsh symbol of division. Thousands of East Berliners have been pouring into West Berlin since the borders were open. And tonight in this city, famous for its carefree nightlife, in this city where the song says, life is a cabaret, tonight in Berlin, it is Freedom Night. But some of the celebrants appear to have gone too far, and some had to be dragged away.
And by midnight that night, there was this huge crowd from the West German side chanting at the people on the other side, come over, come over. And they were scared because they thought they'd get shot. And finally, right before I said good evening, the first kid landed up on the top of the wall. He was an East German, and he looked around and he thought, oh my God. And I came on and said, good evening on one of the most astonishing days in the history of the 20th century. The Berlin Wall is coming down. It was one of the great, great hits of my career, and I had a lot of help. The guy who suggested that I go, for example, and the people who were there, it was a brilliant job.
You conducted the first one-on-one American television interviews with Soviet heads Gorbachev and Putin. How'd you pull that off?
Well, we great executive at NBC. He was an old timer. He always was working the angles. And he took it upon himself to try to get Gorbachev to talk. And he knew a lot of the Russians. And he came to me one day and he said, we got the interview. It was a huge scoop. And so I flew over there. Gorbachev didn't quite play by the rules. He spent the first 10 minutes praising the Soviet Union. He was only supposed to take questions from me. But when he finally shut up, I leaned in and I said to him, Mr. Gorbachev, what happens now? Where do we go from here? And we actually became friends as a result of that interview. When he would come to New York, he'd come to my house for dinner.
Wow.
When I was in Russia, I'd go see him. But he, he kind of overstated his position. And the old right wingers tried to remove him, but he hung in there. And I still am in touch with him. He was one of the great men of the 20th century.
Wow. Tom, let me ask you a couple of current questions, because you're a keen observer of things going on and also candid and very honest. Why is there virtually no bipartisanship in Congress?
Ross, I've thought about that a lot. And the part of the problem is everybody has a microphone now. It used to be that you'd look across America and there were these outlets, Republican, Democrat, and in between. And they had kind of a station. Now you can be living in the most remote part of southwestern Montana, and you can get online because there are the instruments that allow you to do that. And you can pump out stuff that is not true. And I'm not talking about true left or right. I'm talking about it's just not true. And overnight, you'll have a couple million people who believe what you're saying. And so that is spread across the country. And it's kind of a contagion. And this is on the left and on the right and in the middle. And it's, I think, the greatest challenge for a democracy. I really do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and back in the old days, Ronald Reagan would have dinner with Tip O'Neill.
Well, Reagan was, when I arrived in Washington, he'd been governor for 2 terms in California, finishing the 2nd term. And all the New York heavyweights, press people said, he's just an actor. I said, you watch. I had gone through 2 terms with him in California.
Yeah.
He was so savvy. And he was also, I thought, the most important thing. He was able to connect to the American people. He wasn't playing to the newsrooms. He was playing to the American people. And he had that great American story about how he grew up and the whole thing. He was he was kind of a curious guy. He could be kind of awkward in a lot of ways. He would not like to step out of his standing. And then when he would decide to light it up, no one could light it up better than he did. Let me tell you one more funny story about it.
Yeah.
And his last Friday in office, I had the final interview with him, and I'd been there from the beginning. And it was all carefully arranged. And then at the end, he turned to me and he said, Tom, let's have our picture taken out on the Rose Garden. And everybody was, we didn't arrange for that. He said, come with me. So we go out there. And he puts his arm around me. And he said, Nancy and I were talking this morning about you were there at the very beginning of my career. And I said, I sure was, Mr. President. He put his arm around me. The cameraman came over and he said, it worked out pretty well for both of us, didn't it?
And the other thing is, you have the same birthday as Ronald Reagan, February the 6th. Did you ever exchange birthday gifts?
Well, no, but I'll tell you what happened is that we were at the White House one day on our birthday, and I had not said anything about it. And the president came in to the room, and Dan Rather, who has been a friend of mine for a long time, stood up and he said, Mr. President, I'd like to lead my colleagues here in singing happy birthday to you. And so everybody sang happy birthday. And he finished, and Reagan, as only Reagan could, said, well, thanks, Dan. Tom and I really appreciated that because it's his birthday too. I thought Dan was going to pass out at that point.
Next, have you seen our country as divided as it is now?
No. I wasn't around in the 30s when it was pretty divided then, but now the instruments of division are there for anybody. They can just reach over and hit a key, and they can be on the air around the country. And mostly, I find that the people who are in the political game these days are more interested in division than they are in unity. That's what really troubles me.
Yeah. Is there a solution?
It takes courage on the part of people from both parties. They've got to get together and find a way to do this. We cannot continue with this kind of mud fight 24/7. And that's really what it is. The Republicans this past week were giving the president, and what he had done was something that they had recommended 2 years ago. On the other hand, the Democrats are guilty of that kind of thing as well. Everybody just wants to play gotcha, and we've got to get beyond that.
Yeah. Well, like I know that it's a very, very difficult world right now, and hopefully we're going to be able to pull through it. Tom, did you ever have any, I would call favorite TV newscasters you kind of looked up to, or you liked their style, or you later worked with them and really thought they were wonderful people?
Well, I had a lot of those kinds of friends, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, by the way. But David Brinkley was one of my first heroes because he introduced a new style, and it was so succinct and smart and everything. The end of his life was quite tragic. He was not well, and he didn't marry well, and so it was not a very happy time for him, unfortunately. But he was so brilliant, and he could say in a matter of a few words the exact summary of what we were all longing to hear. So he was a great friend of mine at the time. Morley Safer at CBS was like a brother. We were great pals, even though we were on opposite sides of the aisle. And there was nobody like Andy Rooney. He was just hilarious.
Yeah.
And I just like being around. Those are CBS people. At NBC, obviously, I was a beneficiary of working with John Chancellor and the people that were at the head, one game ahead of me. And they treated me extremely well. I was a kid from the West Coast. Who is this guy? What are they doing here? And they would always kind of back me up. So I was always grateful for that. But a lot of my friends, quite honestly, Ross, were in the newspaper business. I'm a writer as well as a broadcaster.
Yeah.
And when they discovered that I could write, they looked at me in a different way.
Yeah. Tom, I have always thought your first love in television news was politics, and you did such a good job covering it.
Well, it was my first love, and it was, I'll tell you, Ross, it was in part because of how I grew up. My mother was a real political junkie. She worked in the post office in the small town. She knew everything that was going on. She wanted to be a journalist. It didn't work out for her, but she would come home at night, and we would talk politics when I was in the 7th grade.
Wow.
She would say something that had happened that day, in the post office. I'll just tell you one quick story. One day, we lived in a quasi-army base in the middle of South Dakota in the 1950s. And she said, Gordon Larson, who was a really popular guy in our town, he fixed your furnace, and he always had a pocket full of candy and everything. He had come in that day to the post office, and he was kind of complaining mildly about the behavior of the high school kids the night before, which was Halloween. And my mother looked at him and said, oh, come on, Gordon, what were you doing when you were 17? And he looked at her and he said, I was landing on Guadalcanal. And he turned around and walked out. And I thought, she came home and she would tell me these stories at the end of the day. And I thought later, when I was writing the book, I called her and I said, where is Gordon Larson? Mother said, I know why you're calling, because he's the guy that you want to talk to. I found him out in Montana, where he was working on the Corps of Engineers. We were all part of the dam business. And I said, I left my number. He called me back and he said, Tommy, why are you calling me? I hadn't seen him in 25 years. And I said, Gordon, I'm writing a book about World War II. And my mother and I remember that you had a tough war. He long paused and he said, I never talk about it. And I said, no, I understand, but I'm doing a big story about it. Then there was another long pause. And I said, Gordon, are you still there? And he said, yeah, but I just realized I'm paying for this phone call. And that's who they were. And then he gave me a great interview.
Yeah. In 2014, a new broadcast facility opened over on the Universal Studios Hollywood lot and was named in Tom's honor as the Brokaw News Center. That facility houses our old station, KNBC, also the Los Angeles Bureau of NBC News, and the Telemundo station. Lynn and I were honored to be among a few of the guests that you invited to that ceremony. That was a very special day.
It was, but I wanted the team to be there, and you were a hugely important part of all that. And I always thought that we were in the business of helping each other.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I counted the number of awards that you've received. I may have missed a few. I looked at the awards, I looked at the speeches. My report is that you've had 37 awards, 15 speeches, 13 of them at commencements. Do you use the same commencement speech?
No, I don't. I always try to be very current. So, and then I always open with, I was a high school whiz kid. I was an outstanding athlete, and I was an outstanding scholar. And then I went off the rails. I dropped out of 2 colleges, and then Meredith kind of brought me around, and I caught up to it again. And so when I do any of those speeches, I always include that, that you're not looking at somebody who's always done things right. And if there's a lesson in humility, it is in failing. And I failed for a couple of years, but I got out of it.
You sure did. You got a Phi Beta Kappa out of it. So I think.
Yeah, I do. I do have a Phi Beta Kappa key, and I also have the President's Medal of Freedom, and I also have the greatest French offer that they have. And so it was to stand there in Paris and get the French acknowledgement was quite moving for me. And my family came as well, and friends were there. So it's been a fantastic life, and I like to think that I still have a filter that is called humility. That I've failed enough in my life that I know how it can happen again. So I don't want that to happen again.
We talked about it briefly. You married Miss South Dakota. How'd you meet Meredith?
Well, it's a good story. I didn't move to Yankton until I was a sophomore in high school. I had been working at a summer camp that year. My dad worked for the Corps of Engineers, so we moved around a lot. And then when I was a sophomore in high school, I was moving to Yankton, and I only knew one person beside a roommate that I had at summer camp. And the roommate had the picture of this girl on his desk, Meredith, and he had a big case on her. But she wrote him a Dear John at the end of the summer saying, this is not going to work out. And that's all I knew about her. So the first day I was in school, some kid came running out of the high school and said, old Meredith is a cheerleader. That's the last thing that they expected. She was a scholar, she was a debater, and she was not part of the cheerleading crowd, but she was a cheerleader. She'd gotten elected when she was a sophomore. And then we became fast friends. I was president of class, she was vice president. We had the leads in the play. She was a cheerleader, I was a jock. And she would always tease me about having too many girlfriends, all that kind of stuff. And then in college, when I kind of ran off the rails, she gave me holy hell. She wrote me a letter saying, I don't know what's going on with you. Your parents are very upset, and I don't want to hear from you again until you straighten out. She's got my number. So I kind of put the pedal to the metal. I got my grades up, and I was going to school and working full time. And one day in the library, she came over and sat down next to me and said, I went too far. And I said, no, I had it coming, Meredith. I really did. And she said, well, I'm impressed with how you made the recovery. So we went and had a cup of coffee and never looked back.
Wow, beautiful. And you had 3 lovely daughters, and they have done very, very well, even when they've gone into professions, right?
Yeah, I couldn't, they were not inclined to do that. Our eldest daughter, they're all here with us, by the way, in Montana right now. Our eldest daughter is a physician, and she's the chief medical officer of the San Francisco Fire Department. She has 2,500 firemen under her thumb, and then she's, dealing with them. The middle daughter is in the entertainment business. She had a wonderful career, and she's now in investing in a lot of entertainment stuff. And the third daughter, Sarah, is a therapist in Los Angeles. She has a huge practice of people her age, in which she tries to help them through these difficult times. So she's very, very busy. And they're all different. They're all independent, and they all give me a lot of grief when they want to.
One final question. Do you consider as one of your top achievements receiving an honorary degree at the University of Oklahoma, my alma mater?
I do, but I'm going to tell you a good Oklahoma story. I did get an honorary degree. And then I went back for a game. I have a fabulous son-in-law. He was a doctor as well, married to our doctor. And he was a big OU graduate. So we went back for a game. And I know the Oklahoma fans. And even though I'd been there during, their most difficult days when the explosion happened, and I had been very supportive of them. And I went down, and I don't think he was the president when you were there.
No, George Cross was the president when I was there.
Yeah.
George L. Cross.
Yeah.
And he made a statement one time. He said, "We're trying to do what we can to make the football players like us."
Right. Well, anyhow, they took me down on the field. I said, I don't want to be seen on camera because I know Oklahoma, how it feels about a lot of reporters. And they introduced me, and I didn't want them to do it. And the boos, they just booed the hell out of me. And the administrators were so embarrassed. And I said, it's Oklahoma, folks.
Tom, you're 81 years old. I'm 82. I think we've proved today that we still have our mental strengths with us. And gosh, I've enjoyed this, and I hope you have. And my friend, I hope that we can stay well together and maybe cross paths again in a few years.
We are connected. There's no question about it. We came up through the same way, from the same kind of backgrounds. We have these fabulous families, and it's been a thrill to be with you.
Thank you, Tom. The pride of Yankton, South Dakota, Tom Brokaw.